First thing you need to understand is how small they were. I know what Keth looked like now. Everyone on Koroth's Reach knows what a grown Keth looks like, or they know the shape of the story that gets told in the garrison towns when someone asks why the Harrow never came back to the frontier belt. But in the beginning, in the year my son Dave was 14 and found the den washed out by a flood, a Keth cub is the size of a man's closed fist. 4 toes, short dense fur the color of wet river clay, eyes sealed shut, a sound when they breathe that is more hiss than whimper. They do not look like anything that will one day be large enough to throw a draft animal clear of a paddock fence. Dave brought 4 of them up from the riverbank in his grain sack, one at a time, because he could only carry one without risking the others, and it took him 3 trips in the mud and the dark, because the flood had hit at night. He was soaked to the collar when he came through the kitchen door of our station house and set the sack on the table with a gentleness that I had not seen him extend to anything in months. He was 14, and gentleness was not the dominant register of 14. I said, "What did you bring into my kitchen, Dave?" He opened the sack and showed me. I knew what they were. I had been running Vast Station for 11 years by then, and Keth are native to the deeper country of Koroth's Reach, where the river systems cut through the upland shelf and the prey herds are thick enough to support something that hunts in packs. I had never seen a cub. Every adult Keth I had seen had been at a distance and moving fast, and the standard advice from the garrison settlement office was to give them wide berth and make no sudden noise. They are not aggressive toward humans absent provocation, but their idea of provocation is not always the same as ours, and a grown Keth. I will describe them more carefully later. When they matter more, is not something you want to provoke. These 4 were not going to provoke anyone. They were breathing in a shallow, fast rhythm that I recognized as distress cold, and the largest of them weighed perhaps 400 grams. I said, "Their mother is gone." Dav said, "The den was under the east bank overhang. The whole bank came down." I looked for her. I thought about it. The practical answer was that Keth are wild animals, and these 4 cubs were not going to survive the night regardless of what I did. And releasing them outside would be both kinder and more sanitary than keeping them on my kitchen table. The practical answer had the weight of everything sensible behind it. Dave was looking at me in the way that 14-year-olds look at their fathers when they know what the practical answer is and are waiting to see if their father will say it out loud. It is not a hostile look. It is worse than that. It is a look that is already grieving the answer before it arrives. I got the lamb feeding kit from the barn, told Dave we were doing this in shifts and that if any of them died in the night it was not his fault and not mine. It was the flood's fault, and he was not to blame himself for anything that was already decided by the river. He nodded seriously. He was a serious boy. His mother, Rel, had died when he was 9. A harvesting accident, fast and total, nothing to be done. And that kind of early grief either makes a person brittle or it makes them serious, and Dav had gone the second way. He cried for a week when Rel died, and then he picked up and kept going. Not because he had stopped feeling it, but because he had decided that feeling it and functioning were not mutually exclusive. I was proud of him for that every single day. We named the cubs that first night, which was probably a mistake in terms of practical thinking, and the right call in terms of everything else. Dav named the 2 with lighter fur Farut and Pale. I named the darkest one Cinder, and the one with the gray chest patch Thresh. We fed them every 3 hours with a lamb teat and a formula mix I adjusted from the livestock manual with a calculation I made up on the spot, and improbably worked. All 4 survived the night. All 4 survived the week. By the 3rd week, they had their eyes open, and Root had discovered that the hem of Dav's work trousers was both chewable and interesting, and Dav would sit in the kitchen after supper with Root attached to his leg and pretend to be annoyed. But he was never annoyed, not once. That trouser hem with a small, concentrated ferocity that seemed disproportionate to his total body weight, which at the time was something approaching half a kilogram. Dave would look down at him with the expression of a person watching something very small, do something that it is extremely committed to, and every time he caught me watching, he would go back to looking at the ceiling. Pale was the opposite. Pale, from the 2nd week, watched everything. She watched the lamp on the kitchen table. She watched the window when the wind moved outside. She watched me at the feed station with an attention that I can only describe as diagnostic, not curious exactly, but analytical, as though she were building a model of how the world worked, and I was one of the relevant data points. I sat down, she would orient toward me. When I moved, she tracked the movement. She never came to be handled as readily as the others. Cinder and Root tolerated handling with the boneless enthusiasm of animals who have no strong feelings about orientation in space, and Thresh tolerated it with the air of something enduring a mild inconvenience. But Pale watched, and I got the impression, even then, that she understood more about the situation than she was letting on. Thresh was the one who tried to climb me first. This happened in the 4th week, when I was sitting at the kitchen table going through the harvest schedule, and I became aware of a small purposeful weight on my left boot, then on my left shin, then at my knee, and looked down to find Thresh making a systematic attempt to reach my shoulder by treating my leg as a vertical surface to be ascended. He was not heavy enough to be uncomfortable. He was, however, very determined. He got as far as my thigh before his grip on my work trousers failed, and he came off in a controlled slide back to the floor, where he sat for a moment with the expression of something reviewing its methodology, and then started over. I let him reach the table. He walked across my harvest schedule and sat down up the north field rotation, looked at me, and made a sound that I had not heard before. Not the feeding hiss, not the distress sound, but something shorter and higher, would later come to understand, was a Keth's general purpose social acknowledgement. He had reached where he wanted to go. He was informing me that this had been achieved. Cinder, that same week, began sleeping against my leg in the evenings. I should tell you about Vast Station, so you understand what we had and what we lost. Korath's Reach is a frontier-grade colony world, which means the soil certification is incomplete, and the garrison presence is one understaffed post at the settlement of Rex Ford, 200 kilometers north. The garrison post covers about 800,000 square kilometers of frontier belt, which works out to roughly one uniformed officer per 40,000 square kilometers, which is not really coverage so much as it is a flag planted in the ground to say that someone theoretically cares. In practice, frontier holdings on the Reach run themselves. You build what you can defend, you grow what the soil will take, and you maintain good relations with your nearest neighbors, because they are your only fast response to anything that goes wrong. My nearest neighbor was Len Pask, 40 kilometers to the east, who ran a small livestock operation and had 3 adult children who rotated, helping her. We exchanged water table readings and weather data weekly. We shared equipment when the transport cost was less than the rental. When Rel died, Len came the same day and stayed for 2 weeks and did not once ask me how I was holding up. It was the correct and only bearable approach. Vast Station was 800 hectares of mixed cultivation, grain, forage crops, a small orchard in the river soil section, with a main house, 2 outbuildings, a grain barn, a cold store, and a livestock pen for the 12 draft-grade animals we used for heavy field work. Dave and I ran it with one hired hand during harvest, and ourselves the rest of the year. It was enough. It was not comfortable by settlement town standards, but it was enough and it was ours. The Keth grew, not quickly at first. First 3 months were slow. They stayed in the station house, moved from the kitchen to a corner of the main room that Dav and I quietly gave over to them without discussing it, and their main activities were sleeping, feeding, and testing the structural integrity of every piece of furniture they could reach. Thresh was the first to climb, was the first to bite hard enough to matter. Pale was the quietest and the most watchful, and Cinder stayed closest to me, would sleep against my leg in the evenings, a warm, dense weight that I had not expected to find comforting, and found very comforting indeed. There is a particular quality to the first year of raising an animal from true infancy. You are involved in the construction of a personality, though you do not know it at the time. Every habit you establish, every response you give to a particular behavior, every routine you keep or break, every touch that says yes, this is allowed, and every turn of the body that says no, that one is not, becomes part of the architecture of the thing you are raising. You discover this only in retrospect, When the animal is grown, and you can see, in the adult patterns, the faint outlines of every decision you made when they were too small to push back. Cinder stayed close because I had been the one on the midnight shifts. In the earliest weeks, when Dav took the dawn to midday shifts and I took the night, Cinder had been the one most likely to need the extra feed, the extra warmth of a hand kept against the fur. I had spent more nights with my back against the cold store wall and Cinder in my lap than I had slept horizontal that first month. He remembered this, I think, in whatever way a Keth remembers things. Not as a narrative fact, but as a body fact, a fact about warmth and proximity, and who had been there when the world was cold and uncertain. Thresh climbed because Thresh was, from the very beginning, a problem solver. Every new surface was a question. Every locked gate was an invitation. By the end of the first year, I had redesigned the kitchen cabinet latches twice, because Thresh had worked out that the original latch mechanism required downward pressure plus lateral pull was within his physical range. I replaced it with a two-step mechanism. He solved that one in 3 weeks. I bought a physical key locks for the cabinet, where I kept the grain supplements, and considered this a reasonable resolution to the problem. Thresh considered it an ongoing project. Root tested the furniture because Root was, in the plainest sense, joyful about the physical world. He tested furniture because the physical world was full of interesting resistances and textures, and it was his nature to encounter them directly. By the end of the first year, he weighed 11 kilograms and had a bite force that had crossed the threshold from amusing to genuinely costly in terms of chair legs. And I had a conversation with him about this that he sat through with every appearance of engaged tension, and then went back to what he had been doing. Dav thought this was extremely funny. I thought it was expensive, and also, if I am honest, extremely funny. Pale in that first year did two things. She watched and she learned. She was the one who understood, before any of the others, that the east outbuilding door required the specific sequence of push then lift to open, and she did not open it herself. She sat in front of it and waited for me, and when I arrived she stepped back and indicated the door with her attention in a way that was the clearest wordless communication I had experienced, since Dav was 5 years old and had not yet acquired the language to explain what he needed. She wanted the door open. She had known for some time how to communicate this. She had waited for the correct moment to do so. I opened the door. She walked in, checked the outbuilding with a systematic circuit of the perimeter, and walked back out and sat down, apparently satisfied. I said, "All right, that's your inspection authority then." She looked at me for a moment in the direct, analytical way she had. Then she walked back toward the main house. By the end of the first year, they were the size of medium dogs. By the end of the second year, large dogs. By the third year, they had grown past anything in the domestic animal range, and were beginning to look like what they actually were, which is to say predators. The Keth body plan is bare-framed at the shoulder and chest, canid at the hip and back leg, with a skull that is broader and flatter than a bear's, and a jaw-closing force that the Frontier Settlement Manual lists as, and I am quoting from memory, not inconsiderable. Their fur had shifted from the river clay color of cubs to the darker, banded adult coat, deep charcoal at the spine, grading to ash gray at the flanks, with the chest and throat going almost black. All 4 of them had the adult eye color by then, which is a pale amber that in certain light reads as gold, and which has the quality of looking at you from behind it, rather than at you. They did not leave. I want to be clear about this, because people have asked me, over the years, whether I kept them penned or fenced or otherwise constrained, and the answer is no. Korath's Reach Keth are not a domesticated species. There is no mechanism by which I could have contained, grown Keth on my station if they had decided to leave. Frontier holdings to the north of us had open Keth territory beyond the ridge line, prey herds, the whole natural inventory that a pack needs. There was nothing keeping them on Vast Station except whatever had decided. Point. In the 3 years since Dav had carried them home in his grain sack, that Vast Station was where they were, first person from outside the station to encounter the Keth after they reached full size, was Toril Hadge, who ran the settlement supply depot at the Rexenford Junction and made the quarterly delivery run to the Frontier holdings on the river belt. Toril had been making this run for 12 years and had seen most things that the frontier had to offer, and was not, by his own description and by the evidence of his general demeanor, a man easily unsettled. He came in on the North Track on a regular delivery day in the Keth's 4th year, when they were each fully grown and had been for some months. I was in the North Field when I heard his transport, and I started walking back toward the station. Meant I was not there when he pulled up to the cold store and found Root lying in the sun on the south side of the paddock and Cinder sitting beside the cold store door. I was still 80 meters out when I heard Toril's transport engine cut. Then silence. Then, after about 30 seconds, his voice, very level, saying, Vass, I need you to come out here, please. I came around the paddock at a jog. Toril was standing beside his transport with both his hands where I could see them, and his eyes on Cinder, who was sitting 4 meters from the cold store door, and looking back at Toril with the amber attention that full-grown Keth can direct at a person when they are not yet sure what category of thing the person is. Root had come around from the south paddock and was standing at the fence line, which was somewhere behind me. I could hear him, and Pale, I assumed, was in the riverside scrub and had seen the transport coming in and had not troubled herself to come out for it, which was accurate. I said, It's all right, Toril. These are my station animals. He looked at me, I said. They were born here, flood orphans. I've had them since they were about this size, and I held up my closed fist. He looked at my fist. He looked at Cinder. He looked at Root at the fence line. He said, Those are Keth. I said, Yes. He said, Those are grown Keth. I said, Yes. He looked at Cinder again. Cinder looked back at him. After a moment, Toril said, in the specific tone of a man updating a category, All right. And then he went around to the back of his transport and started pulling the delivery inventory. 'Cause Toril was also not, by his own description, a man who let the unusual interfere with the schedule. Cinder watched him unload for about 10 minutes, and then lost interest and went back to lying in the sun, which was how most of the delivery proceeded. Toril, on the way out, said to me, Does the garrison of Post know about this? I said, I filed a station animal notification with the settlement office 3 years ago when they were still cubs. I updated it last year when they reached adult size, he said, and they were all right with it. I said, The settlement office noted it and filed it and sent me a confirmation, and that was the end of it. They're not a protected or prohibited species. They're just not domesticated, he said. I can see they're not domesticated, Vass. I said they're not aggressive without provocation. They know who belongs on this station. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man deciding how much follow-up questioning was actually necessary, given that he had a delivery schedule, and that the animals in question had not moved toward him once in the preceding hour. He said, All right. Then he drove out on the North Track, and I watched his dust settle and went back to the North Field. I told Dav about this at supper. He laughed. A real generous laugh, the kind he had gotten from his mother, which opened his whole face. He said, I wish I had seen his hands. I said, Both visible, very still. He said, Correct answer. We had that supper in a good mood, which was itself worth noting. The station had been running hard that season. The forage crop was behind schedule due to a late dry front, and good moods at supper were not to be taken for granted. The Keth were distributed around the main room in their evening postures while we ate, which was unremarkable by that point in our lives, and would have been, to a visitor, probably remarkable. Dav and I talked about this in the 4th year, when the question had become undeniable. It was evening, the good time of day on the reach, when the heat drops, and the light goes amber, and you can sit outside without much effort, and we were both on the cold store casing with tea, Dave with his spoonful of dried fruit concentrate that he had acquired from his mother and never given up. And the 4 Keth were distributed around the homestead in their particular evening postures. Cinder near me, Root on the south side of the paddock watching the field, Thresh doing a slow circuit of the near fence line, Pale sitting at the riverside scrub edge with her back to us and her face toward the water. Dav said, I've been thinking about why they stay. I said, Have you? He said, I think it's because we never gave them a moment of separation. The way it usually works with wild animals raised by hand. There's a point where they're old enough that the instinct of territory reasserts itself. Some part of them that was always there, starts to pull them toward the range. But I think the Keth didn't have that. Every time they were old enough to register the pull toward range, they were already in a place that registered as range. Vast station is their territory because they've never been told it isn't. I thought about this. I said, so they think they're apex predators occupying a territory. He said they are apex predators occupying a territory. I said with a grain farm on it. He said with a grain farm on it and 2 humans who belong to them. I sat with that for a moment. The amber light on the north fields, his slow circuit of the fence line. Pales still back at the riverside scrub edge. I said, I think that's right. He was 19 when he said that. He had grown into the kind of young man who thought carefully before he spoke and meant what he said when he said. He had his mother's hands, square-palmed, strong. The kind that are competent with everything. And my habit of looking at a problem from more than one angle before deciding it was a problem. He had also grown into something that I had not entirely predicted, which was a young man of genuine warmth who was not embarrassed by that warmth. Sit on the cold store casing in the evening with 4 large predatory animals distributed around the homestead, as though this were the ordinary shape of a life, which for him it was, because it had always been. I am going to describe what happened to him as briefly as I can, because the grief of it does not need to be extended for the purposes of what I am telling you. The facts are enough. The Harrow arrived on Corath's Reach in the late dry season of that year. They were a claim-raiding faction, the frontier equivalent of a land grab operation, not affiliated with any settlement authority, moving through the underdeveloped belt worlds ahead of formal land tenure and burning out existing holders to clear titles for resale. They had worked 3 other frontier systems before the Reach. The garrison post at Rex Ford had a single alert filed about their activity in adjacent territory, no action pending. They came in 7 vehicles, 2 heavy transport haulers and 5 smaller utility craft, and they hit tier holdings in sequence, moving south along the river belt. Len Pask Station went first. I did not know this when it happened. The Harrow cut the long-range communication relay at the junction point 12 kilometers north of her holding before they arrived, which meant her signal did not reach me and did not reach the garrison. By the time I found out about Len's station, it was already 3 days gone. They hit the station in the morning. 3rd day of what I now know was a 7-holding sequence. I was in the root cellar beneath the cold store when they arrived. Doing the inventory rotation that I do every 3rd week puts me under a meter of composite flooring, with a cellar hatch that has a slide bolt on the inside. Dav was in the grain barn, running the threshing calibration on the Eastern Bay press. The Keth were in the paddock east of the main house. Cinder and Root were sleeping in. The morning light. Thresh was pacing the fence line, the way Thresh always did in the morning, and Sail was somewhere I could not see from the cellar grate, which means she was likely in the riverside scrub, where she liked to sit. The Harrow did not announce themselves. They drove in across the north track and went directly to the grain barn. I heard the vehicles. The cellar I heard them, and I heard the barn door come open, and I heard Dav's voice. One short, surprised phrase, his working voice. Confused. And then I heard what followed, and I will not describe it in detail, except to tell you that it was fast, and that afterward there was no sound from the barn at all. I stayed in the cellar for the next 4 hours because the Harrow were still on the property for 4 hours. I know the duration because I counted it. I could hear them through the cellar grate, moving through the main house, through the outbuildings, through the grain barn. They took the transport animals, the cold store inventory, the station's fuel reserve, and the communication equipment. They set fire to the main house and the grain barn before they left. The cold store and the root cellar are composite construction and did not burn, which is why I survived. When I came up through the cellar hatch, the main house was ash, and the grain barn was still burning at the south end. The sky was the dark brown that a lot of structural smoke makes when it mixes with the dry season air, and the heat from the barn was strong enough to feel on my face from 30 meters. Dav was in the barn. I will not describe that either. Only's that I spent an hour in the barn and came out knowing everything that I needed to know. The Keth were sitting in the open ground between the ruins of the main house and the cold store. All four of them, in a loose row, facing me. Cinder had ash in his coat. It had settled on him while he sat, and he had not moved to shake it off. Root and Thresh were shoulder to shoulder, which was not their usual posture. Pale was slightly apart, as Pale always was, but her eyes were on me in the specific way that Pale looked at things when she had already understood the situation and was waiting for the rest of participants to arrive at the same understanding. They were each now a little over 1.5 meters at the shoulder. Was the largest. 2 meters at the shoulder if he drew himself up, though he was not drawing himself up now. They were not making any sound. The ash was settling in the still morning air, and the barn was still cracking and subsiding at the south end. And the four of them were sitting in the gray and waiting for me. I said, I know. That was all I said, I know. I went back to the cold store and I found my pack. It was on the lower shelf, where I always keep it for rapid departure against the possibility of a medical emergency. And I loaded it with 3 days of supplies, the station's hand sidearm, 2 reloads, a water filter, and the folded claim document that had Vast Station's coordinates and my registered title. I do not know why I took the claim document. I think I took it because it was the last piece of paper in the world with my son's name and my name on, together, and I was not ready to leave it in a burned building. I buckled the pack and walked back out to where the 4 Keth were sitting in the ash. I said, all right. Let's go. They stood. I want to tell you about the way 4 grown Keth stand up, because I think it is important to the picture I am trying to give you. It is not a dramatic motion. There is no lunge, no display, no sound. They simply unfold from sitting. A smooth, unhurried rise that ends with 4 animals each weighing over 800 kilograms standing on a tier in the ash of a burned grain barn. And the quality of the air changes. It is difficult to explain if you have not been present for it. It is not that anything threatens. It is that the space around them reorganizes to accommodate the fact of what they are, and everything in that reorganized space, including you, if you are standing in it, is suddenly aware of a set of possibilities that were not salient a moment ago. They were looking north, toward the track the Harrow vehicles had taken out. I said north. Yes, I know where they went. I did not know exactly where they went. But the Harrow was moving along the river belt in a southward sequence, hitting holdings in order, and the next holding south of Vast Station was an old, mostly fallow grain plot that had not been actively worked in years and would serve as a staging area if you needed to park 7 vehicles and 40-some personnel for a day or two between operations. I had ridden past it twice on the Northern Survey Circuit. It sat in a riverbend flat that the locals called Coldwater Flats, and it had 3 standing structures, a long bunk building, a vehicle shed, and a feed barn that a raising faction with 40 personnel would find very usable. The Keth turned and looked at me when I said north. I said, they'll be at Coldwater Flats. 23 kilometers. I'll walk it. They looked at me for another moment. Then Cinder turned north and began to walk, and the others followed, and I fell in behind them, and we went. I want to describe the walk because the walk is part of it. They did not move fast. This surprised me. First, I had expected the urgency of the thing to translate into a pace I could not match, and I had been prepared to fall behind and let them go ahead and follow as best I could. But Keth, I was about to learn, do not operate on urgency in the way that urgency is usually understood. A Keth pack moving with intent moves at exactly the pace the situation requires. And the situation of 23 kilometers of frontier scrubland between noon and evening required a pace that I could match. We walked at something between a steady hike and a march. 3 kilometers per hour, maybe 3.5, and they stayed in a loose formation around me, never more than 10 meters ahead or to the side. They were quiet. The frontier scrub is dry and brittle at this time of year, and our passage made some noise. Dry grass cracking. The occasional stone shifted underfoot. But the Keth moved through it with a minimum of disturbance that I found slightly uncanny given their size. Cinder, who was nearest to me most of the walk, placed each foot with a deliberateness that seemed almost considered. Thresh and Root ranged a little to either side. Pale moved behind and slightly right, her head low, which I would come to understand was her traveling posture. After an hour of walking, I stopped to drink from my water bottle, and Cinder stopped too, turned to face me. and I scratched the base of his left ear, which is what I had done every morning of his life. Since the third week after the flood, he held very still while I did it, the way he always had. Then we kept walking. The scrub in the middle section of the route flattens and opens into a shallow basin where the river runs underground for about 4 kilometers, before coming back up at the north edge of Coldwater Flats. This stretch is the most exposed part of the route, no cover, and in the dry season the ground surface is pale and hard, and reflects the afternoon heat upward. I had walked this basin twice in the survey circuits, and found it uncomfortable both times. The Keth handled it differently than I expected. As we crossed into the open basin, their formation tightened. Not dramatically, not with any urgency, just a quiet decrease in the distance between them and me, so that Cinder was 3 meters to my left instead of 10. Root was close on my right. Thresh was perhaps 5 meters ahead, and Pale came in from the rear to within arm's reach of my right side. It was not a protective formation in any trained or martial sense. It was, I thought, just the way a pack moves when the terrain changes and the nature of the exposure changes with it. I thought about what Dav had said. They think they're apex predators occupying a territory. We were crossing exposed terrain in the direction of a threat to the territory. The instinct that organized them closer to me in the open basin was the same instinct that had put Root and Thresh shoulder to shoulder on the north fence line when the territorial male had come down from the upland range. It was not a decision any of them made. It was just what they were. Root, on my right, made a brief pass of his head toward me, and then straightened again. Not quite a nuzzle, not quite anything I have a word for. An acknowledgement, I said quietly. I know, Root. Let's keep moving. And he settled back into his position and we kept crossing the basin, and the heat reflected up from the pale ground. And the late afternoon pressed down from above, and none of it slowed us at all. Think about what it was and what it meant. The two of us standing in the dry frontier scrub, with ash still on his coat, and my son 3 hours dead, in a burned grain barn, and me scratching his ear in the afternoon light, because that was what I did every morning, and the morning had been very wrong, and some things should stay the same if you can manage it. I do not have a grand theory of it. I think it was just that we were both still here, and we had both lost something that could not be replaced, and the ear scratch was one of the few things in the world that neither of us needed to explain to the other. We reached the northern edge of Coldwater Flats as the sun was getting low, maybe 2 hours before full dark. I went to my knee on the ridge lip and looked down at the flat. The harrow was there, 7 vehicles in a loose cluster near the vehicle shed, the 2 heavy haulers and the 5 utilities, lights on in the bunk building and the feed barn, voices carrying on the still air, at least 15 or 20 people audible, probably more inside. Fire in a ring between the bunk building and the vehicle shed, 4 figures around it. I counted what I could see, and estimated 40 to 45 total, which was what the Frontier Settlement Office's intel summary had put the Harrow faction's rating strength at. The 4 Keth were on the ridge around me, heads low, looking at the flat below. Their eyes in the last of the day's light picked up the amber reflection of the Harrow's fire from 200 meters away. None of them were making any sound. Pale was to my right, and for once she was not watching me. She was watching the compound below with the same diagnostic attention she had given to the outbuilding door when she was 3 months old, except that what she was analyzing now was 45 armed people and 7 vehicles, and the conclusion she was drawing was not about which sequence of operations would get a door open. Root and Thresh were side by side again, the way they had been in the ash at Vast Station. I had seen them stand that way exactly twice before in 5 years, once during a period 3 years back when a large, territorial male, Keth, from the upland range, had come down to the lower river country and contested the boundary of their range for 3 days, moving along the station's northern perimeter at night. Root and Thresh had stood shoulder to shoulder on the north fence line each of those 3 nights, not advancing, not retreating, just present, until the territorial male concluded that the cost-benefit analysis of this boundary dispute did not favor continuation and withdrew. And once, the year before last, during a severe flood warning, when the river had come up fast and we had spent 20 hours moving station equipment to high, ground and the water had reached the paddock edge, and Root and Thresh had stood between the water and the cold store for the last 4 hours of the flood peak, as though standing there would be of any structural assistance, which it would not, but they stood there anyway. I studied the layout for about 10 minutes and thought about what I was doing. I was one man with a sidearm and 4 large animals. The sidearm was a standard frontier-grade hand weapon, 10-round capacity, lethal at 50 meters if I was calm. I was not calm. I was the opposite of calm in the way that very quiet, very cold things are the opposite of calm. Not shaking, not noisy, but with a stillness that was not the same as peace. The 4 Keth were on the ridge around me, heads low, looking at the flat below. I thought about Dav in the grain barn. I thought about the look on Len Pask's face the last time I had seen her, which was at the late-season equipment swap, when she had been annoyed about her second tractor's hydraulic calibration, and had said 3 or 4 very pungent things about it that had made both of us laugh. I thought about the claim document in my pack with both our names on it. I thought about the fact that 45 armed people was 45 armed people, and that I was one man, and that what I was considering was not a rescue operation and not a legal action, and was not going to be reported to the Garrison Post as anything other than what it was. I thought about Cinder sitting in the ash with settled ash on his coat, not moving. I thought about Root and Thresh sitting shoulder to shoulder in the smoke. I thought about Pale, who had understood the situation first of all of us, and had been waiting patiently for the rest of us to catch up. I thought about Dav at 19, with his mother's hands, and his cup of tea with dried fruit concentrate, saying, "They think they're apex predators occupying a territory," and me saying, "With a grain farm on it," and him saying, "With a grain farm on it and 2 humans who belong to them." One of those humans was gone. The territory had been burned. I said quietly to the 4 of them, "I'm going in the front. You do what you need to do. Keep it contained to the compound." They looked at me. Pale made a very small sound, barely above a vibration, that I had learned years ago was her confirmation signal, the sound she made when the pack had reached an agreement about something and was ready to act. The others were silent. I stood up and walked down the ridge toward the Harrow's fire. I walked in from the north, which was the direction they had come from, and the direction they were not watching. I walked slowly, upright, no attempt at concealment, and I had covered perhaps 60 meters before the 4 figures around the fire saw me, and the nearest one reached for a weapon. I held up my empty hands. I said, "I am a registered claim holder on the Vast Station grant, 200 meters south of the Upper River Road. I need to speak to whoever is in charge of this group." There was a pause. The figure with the weapon did not lower it. Another figure, larger, stood up from the fire and said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to know what the Harrow's complaint is with Vast Station. I want to understand if there is an error in my title registration that they have a legitimate grievance about." I said this in the calm, flat voice of a man who is asking a factual question. The larger figure, a man broad in the shoulders, wearing a Harrow faction marker on his jacket that I recognized from the settlement intelligence file, said, "There's no error. We don't negotiate title claims with individual holders. The land tenure on this belt is under review, and your registration doesn't hold pending arbitration." I said, "That's not how frontier in your law works." He said, "It is how it works when we say it works." There was a silence. I said, "You burned my grain barn this morning." He said, "That's right." I said, "My son was in it." He looked at me. He had the expression of a man who was not going to apologize and was not going to explain, and was not particularly interested in the statement I had just made. He said, "That's a tragedy. Move on, Holder. We're filing the reclamation paperwork in the morning, and your title will be voided." I said, "I understand." The 4 figures around the fire were watching me. Inside the bunk building, I could hear voices going quiet as people became aware that there was a visitor. The Harrow commander had the posture of a man who had conducted this kind of conversation many times, and found it routine. And then I said, "I'd like you to meet my station animals. There is a sound that Keth make when they are moving at full pace that I had never heard before that night, because they had never before moved at full pace. It is not a roar, and it is not a bark, and it is not any of the sounds that Earth-descended animal cognition reaches, for when it tries to categorize something loud and fast and heavy, it is a deep, Continuous percussion, not rhythmic, not consistent, just the sound of mass in rapid motion through dry air and dry ground. Each footfall a discrete pressure event, 4 sets of them. And underneath the percussion the very low, continuous sound that I will only describe as the sound of something that has decided. They came from 3 sides simultaneously. I had my sidearm up and was already moving to the left, which was the only direction where the 4 figures by the fire and the Harrow commander were not about to be, and I had the commander's weapon arm in my left hand by the time Root cleared the vehicle shed in a single movement that I will only describe as architectural, the kind of motion that redraws the available space of an area by being in it. The weapon arm gave up its weapon without much argument. What happened in the next 40 minutes I will not recount in detail, not because I am protecting anyone's feelings, but because I was not watching most of it. I was managing the outer perimeter, personnel from reaching the vehicles, and doing this in the company of a Harrow commander who had very quickly concluded that cooperation was the correct posture. The sounds from the compound during those 40 minutes were various. The Harrow personnel who reached the outer edge of the compound in their attempts to exit encountered Pale, who was managing the perimeter from the south and east, and made different choices about cooperation from that point forward. At approximately the 30-minute mark, Thresh emerged from the bunk building with 11 Harrow personnel walking ahead of him at a pace that suggested they had collectively reviewed their options and found this one most acceptable. They were directed to the central area of the compound by a presence slightly behind them that I am choosing not to describe further. They sat down. They stayed sitting. By the 40-minute mark, the compound was quiet. The Keth did not kill 45 people. I want to be precise about this, because the story that spread through the frontier belt in the months afterward was imprecise on this point. Final count of Harrow personnel who required garrison medical attention was 11, of whom 3 were serious. The remaining 34 were uninjured and were found when the garrison patrol arrived the following morning, seated in a tight cluster in the center of the compound, very quiet, watched over by 4 large animals who were sitting at the 4 compass points of the cluster, with the focused attention of animals who have decided that nothing in the cluster is going anywhere. The Harrow commander was seated in the center of his own personnel. He had both of his hands. He had all of his teeth. He was wearing the expression of a man who has been shown something that has revised his understanding of several important categories. Still, because he has decided that sitting very still is by far the best option available to him, and intends to continue sitting very still for as long as seems advisable. It would turn out that what seemed advisable to him was approximately 6 hours, was how long it took the garrison patrol to arrive. The garrison officer who arrived with the patrol was a Lieutenant Corse, whom I had met once at a water rights arbitration. She looked at the compound, at the cluster of 34 Harrow personnel, 4 Keth sitting at the 4 corners watching the cluster, and at me, standing near the fire ring with my pack still on my back, and she said, "Vass, what happened here?" I said. "The Harrow raided my station yesterday morning." I said, "They burned the grain barn." She looked at me. I said, "My son was in it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Oren." I said, "I know. I need you to process the formal complaint, and I need the title claim voided." "I have the documentation," she said. "I'll need your account of last night for the record," I said. I walked down from the ridge and requested to speak to whoever was in charge. The station animals were with me. There was a confrontation. The animals acted to prevent the Harrow personnel from accessing their vehicles and exiting the compound. She looked at the compound again. She said, "How many animals?" I said, 4. She looked at the 4 Keth, who were looking back at her with their amber eyes from the 4 compass points of the compound perimeter. She held the look for a moment. Then she looked at the 34 people sitting in the dirt and at the 11 who had gone ahead in the medical transport. Then she looked at me. She said, "Are they going to be a problem for my patrol?" I said no. She accepted this. She was a practical officer, is mostly what you get on the frontier, because the impractical ones transfer out early. She filed the complaint, voided the Harrow's reclamation filing on the grounds of unlicensed use of force against a registered claim holder, and arranged transport for the 34 uninjured Harrow personnel to the Garrett Jensen detention facility at Rex Ford. The Harrow commander was one of the 11. I rode back to Vass Station in the garrison transport, Lieutenant Corse offered when she saw that I had walked in. The 4 Keth ran alongside the transport the whole way. The garrison driver, a young corporal who was probably seeing fully grown Keth at close range, for the first time, kept his eyes very deliberately forward and said nothing about the 4 large animals running beside the vehicle at a pace that matched their cruising speed without apparent effort. I appreciated this. It was exactly the right response. We got back to Vass Station as the sun was coming up. The main house was ash. The grain barn's south end had finished collapsing. The cold store and the root cellar were intact, and the orchard at the river soil section was untouched, and the outbuildings on the east side were undamaged. It was not nothing. It was a long way from nothing. I stood at the edge of what had been the main house for a while, and the 4 Keth came and stood around me. Not in a formation, not organized, not military, not anything that words like formation quite capture. They simply arranged themselves near me, the way things arrange themselves near other things, when they have no intention of being elsewhere. Cinder was on my left. I put my hand on the top of his head, which was now nearly at my shoulder height, and he lowered it slightly the way he had always done when I put my hand there. The ash was still in his coat. Some of it had dried and lightened to the color of the frost we get in the early cold season, and under the morning light he looked like an animal that had walked through something and come out the other side still walking. I said, "We're going to rebuild." He did not respond to this because he was a Keth and not a person, but he also did not move away, which was the response that mattered. I am going to tell you what the next year looked like, because I think the next year is as much a part of this story as the night at Coldwater Flats, and it is the part that is least often told. The Frontier Settlement Office, once the Harrow case was filed and the title confirmed, added a basic reconstruction grant. Composite materials for 1 main structure, 2 outbuildings, enough to start. Len Pask, who had survived her own raid in the root structure of her cold store, and whose station was damaged but not destroyed, 40 kilometers to bring me food for the first 2 weeks. She did not ask how I was holding up. She brought food and helped me sort through the cold store inventory that had survived, and then drove home and came back the following week with her second tractor, which had the hydraulic calibration problem she had complained about. And we spent a day in the wreckage of my east outbuilding, fixing it, which was the most useful thing that had happened to me since before the raid. Len had lost her 2 field workers in her raid. She did not talk about this in terms I was expected to respond to. She talked about it the way frontier people talk about loss, which is to say she talked about the practical problem of being short-handed through harvest, and then stopped talking when the practical part was covered, and we understood each other. The Keth stayed at Vass Station through all of it, through the construction phase, through the first replanting, through the long flat season when everything was work and nothing was anything else, through the winter. They did not stop being what they were. Thresh still paced the fence line in the mornings. Pails still sat in the riverside scrub in the afternoons. Root still tested the structural integrity of things, and Cinder still came to find me in the evenings, wherever I was working, and settled nearby with the solid, warm patience of something that has decided its location for the duration. I had to recalibrate some of my habits in that first year. I had spent 20 years on Vass Station making 2 cups of tea in the morning, 1 for me and 1 for Dave, who had acquired the habit from his mother and never lost it, and who drank his with a spoonful of dried fruit concentrate that he got from the settlement store on supply runs. After the raid, I kept making 2 cups for several weeks before I caught myself. The catching yourself part of grief is not the hard part, exactly, but it has a texture that other parts do not have. A small daily ambush. A thing that was so automatic it continued past the point where it made sense. And the stopping of it each time is a small repetition of the original loss. I mention this not for the sentiment of it, but because of what happened on the morning I noticed Cinder watching me. I had made the 2 cups. I had set them both on the top of the cold store casing, which is where I sat in the mornings when the weather was right, and I had caught myself and I was standing there looking at the second cup for a moment before I was going to pour it out. Cinder was sitting 4 meters away, looking at me with the specific amber and gold attention that Keth have, and something in the way he was looking was not the passive observation of an animal watching a person. It the attention of something that understood the shape of what it was seeing. I said, "He's gone." He kept looking. I said, "I know you know." I said, "I'm working on it." He made the very small sound that Pale usually made, the confirmation sound, the "we have reached an agreement" sound. And then he put his head down and looked at the ground, which I had not seen him do before, and it took me a moment to understand that he was not looking at the ground. He was just not looking at the second cup. He was giving me the moment without watching. I poured the cup out. Then I scratched his ear and drank my own cup, and we watched the sun come up on the rebuilt east outbuilding and the replanted north fields, and the part of the grain barn that was standing again, and the part that was still framing. I will tell you what happened to the harrow, because you are probably wondering, and because it is short. The formal complaint filed by Lieutenant Kors, combined with the complaints from the 6 other raided holdings on the frontier belt and 2 holdings on adjacent frontier systems, resulted in a Frontier Authority enforcement proceeding that took 14 months and ended with the Harrow faction's land claim entity dissolved and its assets frozen. The 34 personnel detained at Coldwater Flats received various sanctions. The Harrow commander received a longer sanction. I was not present at the proceeding and do not know the details. Lieutenant Kors sent me a data message when it concluded, which said only, "Done, Oren." See, I sent back, "Thank you." I said nothing about the night at Coldwater Flats. In the enforcement proceeding beyond my formal statement of events, which was accurate and complete, and did not editorialize. The garrison's documentation noted that the Harrow personnel had been detained and restrained by the station animals without fatalities, and that this was unusual and commendable given the provocation involved, and this phrasing was allowed to stand. The story spread along the frontier belt anyway, as these things do. Frontier people talk to each other, because frontier people are mostly far from everyone, and news is a form of warmth. The shape the story took was something like: a vast station holder walked into the Harrow camp alone after the raid and brought his 4 Keth with him, and they did what was necessary. And afterward there were 34 men sitting in the dirt, not saying anything, while the Keth watched them from the corners, and the garrison showed up in the morning and found it that way. The story did not have a villain's dramatic speech, or a battle plan, or a moment of tactical genius. It was in the way frontier stories usually are, a story about someone doing what needed to be done in the most direct way available to them. Some people, when they heard it, thought it was about me, about whatever I had, or whatever the walk down the ridge represented, or whether I was brave in some technical sense. I want to be precise about this. I walked down the ridge and asked to speak to the man in charge, and had a conversation that lasted about 4 minutes. The walk down was 20 meters of open ground, and I was honest throughout the conversation, and I handed over the Harrow commander's weapon when the moment came, and held the perimeter for 40 minutes and answered the garrison officers' questions in the morning. These are not the actions of a brave man. These are the actions of a man who had 4 large animals with him and knew it. Happened at Coldwater Flats was decided long before I walked down that ridge. It was decided in the moment. Dav looked up at me over a grain sack full of 4 cold dying Keth cubs and waited to see what I was going to say. It was decided in the 3-hour feeding shifts, and in the naming of Root and Pale, and in the years of Thresh pacing the fence line in the mornings, and Root testing every piece of furniture he could reach, and Thresh solving cabinet locks and Pale sitting put in front of the outbuilding door and waiting patiently for the rest of the world to understand what she already understood. It was decided in the way they sat in the ash after the fire, with the patience of things that know exactly where they are and exactly who they are waiting for. They were not weapons. I did not raise weapons. I raised 4 Keth, who understood that Vass Station was theirs, and that the people of Vass Station were theirs. And when someone took something from them that could not be given back, they did what a pack does when someone takes something that cannot be given back. I happened to be there. I think about Dav's word for it. The word he used when he was 19, thinking carefully before he said it. Family. Not in the sentimental sense. Not as a word for something warm and photogenic and placed on a shelf. In the old sense, the working sense, the one that means the group of beings who share a stake in the same thing and defend it together, and do not require elaborate explanation to understand each other. That is what we were. That is what Vast Station was, in the years we had together, and what it still is, in the years since. Korath's Reach frontier belt has not seen another Harrow-style incursion. This may be enforcement. It may be that the 14-month proceeding made the frontier belt unprofitable for that kind of operation. It may be the story that spread along the holdings and reached, eventually, the kind of people who plan these things and made them consider whether the math worked out. All three of those things are probably true simultaneously, and the relative weights do not matter to me. What matters to me is that Lenny Pask is still running her station 40 kilometers east, short-handed and making it work, and that the 6 other holdings on the belt that the Harrow hit are standing and operating, and that the frontier belt is, by any reasonable measure, quieter than it has been in a decade. I don't have an opinion about what caused that quiet. I'm not in the business of knowing. I'm in the business of grain and forage crop and an orchard that came back stronger after the fire than it was before. Which is a thing that sometimes happens with fire-adapted root systems on frontier soil, and which Dav would have had a precise biological explanation for, if he had been here to give it. I keep the claim document in the rebuilt cold store, in the same place it has always been. On the lower shelf where I keep the pack for rapid departure against the possibility of a medical emergency. 4 Keth are still at Vast Station. Root's muzzle has gone lighter in the last 2 years. Not gray, exactly, but a shade or two toward it, which I understand is how the aging shows in this species. Thresh still paces the fence line in the mornings, though his circuit is slower now, and he stops more often to check the field line, which I take as either a sign of age or an increase in thoroughness, and have chosen to interpret as the latter. Pale still sits in the riverside scrub, although she has a particular boulder on the east bank that she has claimed as her afternoon post, and where she can be found reliably from mid-afternoon until the sun drops below the ridge. Cinder still comes to find me in the evenings. I make 1 cup of tea in the mornings now. I drink it on top of the cold store casing and watch whatever the morning is doing. The light on the north fields, the way the river sounds different in different seasons. The draft animals in the rebuilt pack, doing whatever it is draft animals do, when no one is asking them to do anything else. Cinder is usually nearby, not always touching, not always watching me specifically, just present in the way that something is present when its position and intention have both been settled for a long time and don't require assessment. On the anniversary of the flood that took the Keth's mother and brought 4 clay-colored cubs into my kitchen in a grain sack, I take a walk down to the river. I don't do anything particular when I get there. I stand on the bank for a while and look at the water. The 4 Keth come with me every year, which I did not plan, and they did not ask about, but which happens, and has happened every year since the year after the fire, which was the first year I took the walk. We stand on the bank for a while. The river is the same river it was the night Dav made his 3 trips in the mud and the dark, carrying 1 cub at a time in his grain sack because he could not risk carrying more. It is the river that took their mother and gave us all an occasion to be standing where we were, which was, for the years we had it, the right place in the world for all of us to be. Then we walk home. I think that is in the end what all of this is. The thing Dav understood when he was 19 and had his mother's hands, and his mother's way of going forward through things that could not be undone. The thing that was decided in the moment he looked up from the grain sack and waited to see what I was going to say. You go to the river, you stand there a while, you walk home, and the pack walks with you, every time, without being asked.